Welcome, my friend. Let everything slow. Among all the servants who once stood at Queen Marika's side, none walked closer to her than the beast bound to her as a shadow, a creature of loyalty so absolute that he would come to carry the whole weight of death itself upon his shoulders. Long before the Tarnished ever climbed the ruined steps of Crumbling Farum Azula to face him, Maliketh was already a legend whispered in fragments, the shadowbound beast who served as Marika's own dark reflection. Tonight we begin his story, with the shadow he became and the queen he served without question. Tonight we sit with the shadow of Marika, the beast bound to serve a queen who would, in the end, betray him. Tonight we sit with the shadow of Marika, the beast bound to serve a queen who would, in the end, betray him. A shadow given, not born. Maliketh was more than a servant of Marika. He was her shadow in truth, a being bound to her so closely that the two were spoken of as reflections of a single will. Among the many titles the lands between grants its most feared and most faithful figures, few carry the weight of the one given to Maliketh, the shadow-bound beast, a creature bound to Queen Marika, not as an ordinary servant is bound to a ruler, but as a shadow is bound to the one who casts it. He is remembered in the fragments of lore that survive him as Marika's half-brother, a kinship stranger and more intimate than any ordinary bond of blood, tying the two of them together in a manner few other figures in the lands between could claim to share with their god and queen. To call Maliketh a shadow was no idle poetry. He served Marika in the manner a shadow serves the one who casts it, present wherever she required him, moving unseen and unquestioned to carry out whatever task her will demanded. Where Marika ruled in the light, in the golden halls and public ceremonies of the order she was building, Maliketh moved in the spaces her light did not reach, a dark counterpart to her radiant authority, doing what needed doing without the burden of glory or recognition that came so naturally to the queen he served. Carved into the ancient shrine that would one day become his final resting place, stand statues depicting a scene from ages before his service to Marika began. 3 wolves attending a young Empyrean, kneeling in prayer beneath the glowing image of a primordial Elden ring. Whatever this scene records of Maliketh's own earliest history, before his binding to Marika, before he became the shadow the whole of the lands between would come to fear and revere, it hints at an older story still, one of peace and prayer and devotion. Long before the Golden Order ever gave shape to the world, he would spend his whole existence serving. There is a particular mystery in this carved memory, one the lands between never resolves in whole. Who was the young Empyrean the wolves attended, kneeling in such evident reverence? Was this Marika herself, in some age before her rise to godhood, or some other figure whose place in this story has since faded from memory entirely? The shrine offers no clear answer, only the image itself, preserved in stone long after whatever event it depicts had passed beyond living memory. What is certain is that Maliketh's story did not begin with his binding to Marika as her shadow, but reaches back further still, into an age of beasts and prayer, this later history only glimpses in fragments of carved stone. This deeper history matters for understanding the nature of the bond Maliketh would come to share with Marika. He was not a creature summoned into existence for the sole purpose of serving her, shaped from nothing to fit a role already decided before his making. He arrived at her side already possessed of his own history, his own devotion, his own ancient ties to beasts and prayer that long predated the Golden Order. Whatever bound him to Marika, it was forged between two beings, who had each already lived through ages the other had not shared, a kinship built atop histories only partly known to one another. Charteti, the beast beneath the devotion. Beneath his role as Marika's shadow, Maliketh carried the nature of a beast, a wildness held in check by a discipline few creatures of his kind could ever have mastered. There is a wildness to Maliketh that his long service to Marika never entirely tamed, a beast's nature carried beneath the discipline of a warrior sworn to a queen's cause. This is no small detail to set aside, for it marks Maliketh as something rarer and stranger than an ordinary knight or champion bound to royal service. He wasn't raised to nobility and trained toward loyalty in the manner a human lord might raise a favored retainer. He carried, at the very root of his being, something closer to the wolves depicted in the ancient shrine that would one day mark his final battle, a beast's ferocity harnessed and turned toward a single, unwavering purpose. This tension between beast and devotion would come to define nearly everything Maliketh accomplished across the whole of his long service. Where an ordinary warrior might struggle only with questions of courage or skill, Maliketh carried the added burden of holding a beast's wild nature in perfect check, bending an instinct built for hunting and violence toward the far more disciplined work of serving as a queen's silent enforcer. That he succeeded so thoroughly that history remembers him as a shadow of perfect and unwavering loyalty, rather than as a beast unleashed, speaks to a mastery of self that few creatures, beast or otherwise, could ever hope to match. And there is a lonely dignity in what this mastery cost him. A wolf, given the discipline of a shadow, does not merely become something new. It carries the whole of its wild nature forward, restrained rather than erased, a ferocity always present beneath the calm and dutiful surface Marika's service demanded of him. Whatever Maliketh once was, before three wolves knelt in prayer beneath a primordial ring, he chose, or was chosen, to bury that wildness beneath a devotion so total that the beast beneath it would remain hidden from nearly everyone who ever crossed his path. This buried wildness would surface in the ages still to come, in ways few who knew only the disciplined shadow could have anticipated. A creature who spends centuries restraining a beast's instinct does not do so without cost, the effort of that restraint itself a kind of quiet, unending labor running alongside whatever other duties his service to Marika demanded. To watch Maliketh in his most controlled and dutiful moments was to witness only the surface of a far more complicated existence, a wolf's hunger and a shadow's discipline locked in a struggle that never resolved itself in whole, however well he managed to keep that struggle hidden from view. There is something worth honoring in a devotion that costs this much to maintain. Many who serve loyally do so because loyalty comes easily to their nature, a comfortable fit between temperament and duty that asks little real sacrifice of them. Maliketh's loyalty was not of this comfortable kind. Every day he served as Marika's shadow was, in some sense, a day spent actively holding a wilder self in check, a discipline chosen and renewed rather than merely inherited, making his devotion to her cause all the more remarkable for how much it demanded of him beneath the calm surface he presented to the world. Marika's sole need. Marika's purpose in binding Maliketh to herself as a shadow was singular and specific. She required a vessel loyal and formidable enough to be trusted with the safekeeping of Destined Death itself. Whatever affection or kinship bound Marika and Maliketh together as half-siblings, her purpose in claiming him as her shadow was, by the accounts that survive, narrow and deliberate. She required a vessel, a being of sufficient loyalty and sufficient strength to be trusted with a task no ordinary servant could be asked to bear: the safekeeping of Destined Death, the terrible power that governs the true and final ending of all things. This was no honor granted lightly, nor a role Marika offered to any figure whose devotion she had not tested and found unshakable. To be chosen for this purpose marked Maliketh as something unique even among Marika's closest servants. Were her children, the demigods, who would one day inherit shards of the shattered Elden ring, were raised to rule and to war over the fragments of her design. Maliketh was set apart entirely from that inheritance, bound instead to a single and singular purpose that had nothing to do with thrones or shards or the shape of the Golden Order's future governance. He was to be the vessel for death itself, a role that asked nothing of ambition and everything of unwavering, unquestioning service. This distinction sets Maliketh apart from nearly every other figure of consequence in the whole of Marika's household. Her demigod children would come, in time, to war among themselves, each pursuing their own vision of what the shattered ring's inheritance ought to mean. Ambitions that would, in time, tear the Golden Order apart from within. Maliketh alone among Marika's closest kin was given no shard to covet, no throne to imagine claiming, no domain of his own to rule. His purpose was narrower than any of theirs, and, in its own way, heavier, not to inherit a piece of his mother's design, but to guard the one power capable of ending every design she or her children would ever build. There is a strange freedom hidden within this narrowness, whatever burden it also carried. While Marika's demigod children spent themselves in ambitions that would, in the fullness of time, consume them each in turn, jealousy and rivalry, and grasping pride poisoning bond after bond between siblings who ought to have stood together, Maliketh was spared this particular fate entirely. He had nothing to covet among his kin, no shard to envy, no throne to imagine resting from a brother or sister's grasp. His purpose kept him apart from the whole poisoned inheritance that would, in the ages still to come, tear the rest of Marika's family into warring fragments. Whether Maliketh himself ever recognized this narrow purpose as a kind of mercy set beside the fates his siblings would later suffer, the surviving record never says. What can be said is that his path and theirs diverged from the very beginning, his loyalty fixed upon a single sacred task, while theirs scattered across a dozen competing ambitions, a divergence that would, in the ages still to come, leave him standing nearly alone among all of Marika's children and kin, still faithful to a purpose none of his warring siblings had ever been asked to bear. It is worth pausing on the particular cruelty embedded in this arrangement, one that the Lands Between's own fragmentary record makes plain in a single quiet phrase, that even in choosing him for this sacred purpose, Marika would, in the end, betray him. Whatever devotion Maliketh gave to the task his queen and sister set before him, whatever loyalty he proved across the ages that followed, the bond between Shadow and Empyrean would not spare him from whatever betrayal still waited, somewhere down the long road his service to Destined Death would carry him. There is a particular weight to being chosen for one's usefulness, rather than for one's own sake, a weight that colours the whole of Maliketh's long service, even before the betrayal the record hints at ever comes to pass. Marika did not bind Maliketh to herself out of simple affection between siblings, nor out of any desire to elevate him for his own sake. She required a vessel, and he possessed the loyalty and the strength such a vessel demanded. Whatever warmth may have existed between them as half-siblings, the record leaves little doubt that Maliketh's role was defined from its very beginning, by what he could provide rather than by who he was in his own right. And yet Maliketh gave himself to this purpose regardless, without any recorded protest, without any hesitation the surviving fragments of his story ever preserved. Whether this reflects a devotion so complete that questions of his own worth never troubled him, or a beast instinct toward loyalty so thoroughly ingrained that refusal was never really within his power to consider, the lands between leaves unanswered. What is certain is that he accepted the burden of destined death without complaint, carrying forward a purpose chosen for him by another, and would spend the whole of his existence proving worthy of a trust that, in the end, proved less trustworthy in return than he had ever given reason to doubt. What that betrayal cost him, and the terrible hunt Marika first set him upon to claim the very power he would spend the rest of his existence guarding, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow we sit with the hunt for the Gloam-Eyed Queen, and the battle that first bound Destined Death to Maliketh's blade. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sit with the hunt for the Gloam-Eyed Queen, and the battle that first bound Destined Death to Maliketh's blade. Before the Golden Order could be founded, before Marika could claim the authority that would shape the whole of the lands between for ages to come, one power stood beyond her reach, Destined Death itself, held by a rival Empyrean, whose black flame had once burned bright enough to slay gods. To claim that power, Marika turned to the one servant she trusted above all others, sending her shadow to hunt down the Gloam-Eyed Queen and bring back the death she alone could not yet command. Tonight we sit with the hunt for the Gloam-Eyed Queen and the battle that first bound Destined Death to Maliketh's blade. Tonight we sit with the hunt for the Gloam-Eyed Queen and the battle that first bound Destined Death to Maliketh's blade. The Godskin Apostles and their Queen. Before Marika's Golden Order rose to shape the lands between, the Gloam-Eyed Queen led the Godskin Apostles, wielders of a black flame said to hold the power to slay gods. Long before the golden banners of Marika's order ever flew across the lands between, another power held sway, one built around a flame darker and, by some accounts, more terrible than anything the coming Golden Order would ever wield. The Godskin Apostles served this power, warriors and zealots bound to a black flame said to carry the capacity to slay even gods themselves, a claim few other forces across the whole history of the lands between could make with any credibility. At their head stood the Gloam-Eyed Queen, an Empyrean whose authority over this terrible flame marked her as one of the most formidable rivals any power seeking to unify the lands between would ever have to face. The nature of the Gloam-Eyed Queen's own claim to Destined Death remains only partly recorded in whatever fragments survive her fall. But what is certain is this: she held the power of Destined Death within her domain, commanding it in some fashion the Godskin Apostles' black flame drew strength from. This made her rule a direct obstacle to whatever Marika intended for the order she was building, for no vision of a unified Golden Order could proceed, while Destined Death remained in the hands of a rival Empyrean, whose own flame burned with a fury capable of unmaking gods. Whatever ambitions Marika carried for the crusade, she was assembling in service of the greater will. The Gloam-Eyed Queen's continued command of this terrible power stood as the single greatest obstacle still standing in her path. Other rivals might be persuaded, absorbed, or merely outlasted by the patient work of building an order meant to endure for ages. The Gloam-Eyed Queen's claim to Destined Death allowed for no such patience. As long as she held that power, Marika's own design remained incomplete, and the peace the Golden Order promised to bring across the lands between remained in its most essential sense, unfinished. There is a symmetry worth noting between the Gloam-Eyed Queen's rule and the order that would later replace it. Both powers, in their own fashion, sought to impose a single unifying authority across the fractured lands between, each claiming a divine or near-divine sanction for the order they intended to build. Where they differed most sharply was in their relationship to death itself. The Gloam-Eyed Queen's reign kept Destined Death close at hand, a power wielded openly by her apostles and central to whatever order she had built around it. Marika's Golden Order would come to do the opposite, seeking to remove Destined Death from the world entirely, sealing it away rather than wielding it, a fundamental difference in philosophy that the coming battle between Maliketh and the Gloam-Eyed Queen would settle, in the end, through force rather than persuasion. Dessin. The hunt begins. To claim Destined Death from her rival, Marika turned to the one servant whose loyalty and whose strength she trusted above all others, sending Maliketh to hunt the Gloam-Eyed Queen down. Facing a rival whose command of Destined Death threatened the whole foundation of the order she intended to build, Marika turned to the shadow she had bound to herself for precisely this purpose. Maliketh was dispatched to hunt down the Gloam-Eyed Queen and claim, by whatever means necessary, the power that stood between Marika and the completion of her design. This was no small task assigned lightly. It demanded a warrior capable of confronting an Empyrean whose black flame had already proven itself capable of ending gods. A confrontation few other figures in the whole of the lands between could have hoped to survive, let alone win. The choice of Maliketh for this mission reveals something essential about the trust Marika placed in her shadow, a trust that went beyond mere loyalty into genuine confidence in his capacity to succeed where a lesser warrior would surely have failed. She did not send an army against the Gloam-Eyed Queen, nor a council of her most powerful servants working in concert. She sent Maliketh alone, trusting that the beast bound to her as a shadow carried strength enough to accomplish what an entire host might otherwise have struggled to achieve. A wager staked upon a single warrior's capacity to face down a power that had already proven itself capable of slaying gods. What Maliketh carried into this hunt beyond his own formidable strength remains a matter the surviving record leaves largely to inference. He had, by this point in his long service, already mastered the discipline of holding his own beast nature in perfect check, a mastery that would surely have served him well against an enemy whose own power ran hot and terrible. Whatever fear or hesitation another warrior might have carried into such a confrontation, Maliketh's whole existence had, by this point, been shaped around a devotion to Marika's cause absolute enough to leave little room for doubt about whether this hunt was one he could, or should, refuse. There is a particular weight in imagining what such a hunt must have demanded of him. Tracking a rival Empyrean across whatever distances and dangers separated Marika's growing order from the Gloam-Eyed Queen's own domain. This was no swift errand completed in a single afternoon, but a genuine campaign of pursuit, a hunt in the truest sense of the word, one that surely tested every part of the discipline Maliketh had spent so long cultivating. To hunt a rival capable of wielding a flame that could slay gods is to accept that failure means not merely defeat, but annihilation, a risk Maliketh appears to have accepted without any recorded hesitation. And there is something worth marking in the solitude of this mission, a task Marika entrusted to a single warrior rather than to any host or council. Whatever else this choice reveals about her confidence in Maliketh's strength, it also reveals something about the nature of the task itself, A confrontation perhaps better suited to a single devoted shadow moving unseen than to any army whose approach the Gloam-Eyed Queen's own considerable power might have detected and prepared against, long before battle was ever joined. The Black Flames fall. Maliketh defeated the Gloam-Eyed Queen, binding the power of Destined Death into his own blade, and in doing so, sealed away the source of the Godskin Apostle's god-slaying flame. The confrontation between Maliketh and the Gloam-Eyed Queen ended, by every account that survives it, in Maliketh's victory, a triumph that would reshape the whole balance of power across the lands between. In defeating her, he did not merely remove a rival from Marika's path. He claimed, in the same act, the power of Destined Death itself, binding it into his own blade, the weapon that would come to be known across the whole of the lands between as the Black Blade. What the Gloam-Eyed Queen had once commanded now belonged, in its most essential form, to Maliketh alone. This victory carried consequences that reached far beyond the fate of the Gloam-Eyed Queen herself. The Godskin Apostles, whose black flame had drawn its terrible power from the very Destined Death their queen once commanded, found the true source of their strength sealed away in the aftermath of her fall. The flame that had once carried the power to slay gods lost, in the wake of Maliketh's victory, the truest measure of what had made it so feared, its capacity for that ultimate destruction bound now within the blade Maliketh carried, rather than the fire the Apostles had once wielded so freely. There is something worth marking in how thoroughly this single battle reordered the balance of terrible power across the lands between. A flame that could slay gods, commanded by a queen whose authority had stood as one of the last true obstacles to Marika's ambitions, was reduced in a single confrontation to a diminished shadow of what it had once been, its truest strength drawn away and bound within a single blade carried by a single warrior. Whatever the Gloam-Eyed Queen's own history and ambitions might have been, they ended here, at the hands of the shadow Marika had sent to claim what she alone could not yet command. The surviving Godskin Apostles, stripped of the true source of their black flame's power, would carry the memory of this defeat forward across every age that followed, their fire never again burning with the god-slaying fury it had once possessed under their fallen queen. Whatever remained of the Apostles' order after this loss persisted in a diminished form, their black flame still capable of terrible harm, but no longer the world-altering weapon it had been, while Destined Death still answered to their queen's command. In this way, Maliketh's victory did not merely defeat a single rival, it permanently reshaped the character of an entire rival faction, leaving them to serve out the remainder of their existence in the shadow of a power they could never reclaim in whole. The founding of the Golden Order. With Destined Death claimed and bound within the Black Blade, the last true obstacle to Marika's ambitions was removed, and the Golden Order rose at last to shape the whole of the lands between. With the Gloam-Eyed Queen defeated and Destined Death claimed, the path lay open at last for Marika to complete the design she had long been building toward. The Rune of Death, now safely bound within Maliketh's blade, rather than commanded by any rival power, could be removed from the Elden Ring entirely, a removal that would come to define the whole character of the Golden Order that followed. Death itself, once a power any sufficiently strong Empyrean might claim and wield, was set aside from the ordinary workings of the lands between, held in trust by a single devoted guardian, rather than left within reach of ambition or rivalry. This act, more than perhaps any other single deed in the whole founding of the Golden Order, shaped the character of the age that followed. A lands, Between without Destined Death readily available, became a realm where true and final ending grew rare, where the dead did not always stay dead, where the ordinary cycle of mortal life found itself altered by the absence of the very power that had once made endings complete. Whatever else the Golden Order would come to represent across the ages of its long rule, this single act, Maliketh's victory, and the sealing of death that followed it, stands as one of its truest founding moments. It is worth pausing to consider how strange a foundation this made for an order that would come to define itself by permanence and by golden, unchanging order. The Golden Order rose not from some act of pure creation, but from an act of removal, the taking away of a power that had, until that moment, remained an ordinary and available part of how the lands between worked. Every age of golden stability that followed rested at its root upon this single absence, a world reshaped less by what the new order added to it than by what Maliketh's victory had taken away. And so, Maliketh's hunt for the Gloam-Eyed Queen became in the end far more than the defeat of a single rival. It became the act that made the Golden Order possible at all, the victory that let Marika claim an authority no longer contested by any power capable of ending what she built, through Destined Death alone. What Maliketh had won, he would now be trusted to guard, a burden that would prove, in the ages still to come, far heavier than the battle that first placed it in his keeping. There is a fitting irony worth pausing on, one that would only become clear across the long ages of guardianship still ahead of him. Maliketh's greatest triumph, the victory that made him, however briefly, the most consequential figure in the founding of the whole Golden Order, would not bring him glory or elevation in the manner such triumphs bring to other warriors. It would bring him instead a lifetime of quiet, unglamorous vigilance, standing watch over a power he had won but could never again wield freely, his moment of decisive action giving way to an eternity of careful, unheralded guardianship. The hunt that made him legendary would prove to be, in retrospect, the easiest part of the burden Destined Death would ask of him. What became of that trust, and the terrible night when a fragment of the very power he had claimed was stolen from him, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow we sit with the night the blade was broken, and the theft that would haunt Maliketh for every age that followed. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sit with the night the blade was broken, and the theft that would haunt Maliketh for every age that followed. Maliketh had defeated a queen whose flame could slay gods, had bound the whole of Destined Death within his own blade, and had stood for ages as the one guardian trusted to see that power never again fall into hands that might misuse it. And still, on a single terrible night the lands between remembers as the Night of Black Knives, a fragment of the very power he had sworn to guard was taken from him. Tonight we sit with the night the blade was broken, and the theft that would haunt Maliketh for every age that followed. Tonight we sit with the night the blade was broken, and the theft that would haunt Maliketh for every age that followed. A guardian's one task. For ages after his victory over the Gloam-Eyed Queen, Maliketh's whole purpose narrowed to a single unwavering task: ensure that Destined Death, once claimed and bound, would never again slip free into hands that might misuse it. Recall what Maliketh's victory over the Gloam-Eyed Queen had won for Marika's growing order. A lands between where Destined Death no longer answered to any rival's command, its terrible power bound instead within a single blade carried by a single devoted guardian. This victory came with an unspoken but absolute expectation attached to it, one Maliketh accepted as readily as he had accepted every other burden his queen and sister asked him to bear, that having claimed this power, he would now guard it without fail, for as long as his existence lasted, against any hand that might seek to claim it in turn. For ages, this guardianship held Maliketh's discipline, the same mastery of self that let a beast's wild nature serve as a shadow's perfect instrument, extended now to the deeper task of holding Destined Death secure against every threat the lands between might send against it. No rival queen rose again to challenge his claim upon it. No army proved bold enough to test whether the guardian who had once slain a Godflame's mistress might be overcome by force. The Golden Order flourished across these long ages of guardianship, its stability resting, however few among its people ever recognized the debt, upon Maliketh's unbroken vigilance. There is a particular kind of labor in guardianship that differs sharply from the labor of conquest, one worth pausing on before this story turns to the night that labor failed at last. To win a single decisive battle, however difficult, is to succeed once in full and be done with the matter. To guard something across ages is to succeed again and again, silently, with no single moment of triumph to mark each day the guardianship held. Maliketh's victory over the Gloam-Eyed Queen earned him a place in whatever histories the lands between preserves. The ages of quiet, unheralded vigilance that followed earned him nothing so visible, only the continued absence of catastrophe, a success too quiet to be celebrated even as it was, in its own way, no less demanding than the battle that first made his guardianship necessary. This quieter labor asked something different of Maliketh than the hunt for the Gloam-Eyed Queen ever had. Where that earlier task demanded a single burst of decisive courage and strength, the long guardianship that followed demanded a different kind of endurance entirely, a discipline sustained not for the length of one confrontation, but across ages of unbroken watchfulness, with no clear end in sight and no promise that the vigilance would ever be permitted to rest. This long success bred, perhaps unavoidably, a confidence that the guardianship itself might prove unbreakable, that having survived the confrontation which first won this power, nothing gentler or more subtle could ever hope to succeed where open battle had already failed. It was a confidence the Knight of Black Knives would shatter entirely, revealing that a guardian capable of defeating a god-slaying queen in open combat might still be vulnerable to a theft that required no battle at all, only cunning enough to find the one crack a purely martial guardian could never have thought to defend. The theft. On the night of Black Knives, a fragment of Destined Death was stolen from Maliketh's keeping, a theft accomplished not through open battle, but through scheme and shadow. The details of that terrible night belong to a story this channel has already told in full, the plot that claimed Prince Godwyn's life and set loose consequences that would echo across the whole of the lands between for ages beyond counting. What matters here for Maliketh's own story is simpler and starker. On that night, a fragment of the Destined Death he had sworn to guard was stolen from him, taken not through the kind of open confrontation his strength had already proven equal to, but through a scheme cunning enough to slip past whatever vigilance a guardian built for battle could offer. This was, for Maliketh, a failure unlike any other he had ever known. He had proven himself capable of defeating an Empyrean whose flame could slay gods, a triumph that stands, even now, among the most consequential victories in the whole history of the lands between. And yet, this same guardian, so formidable in open combat, found himself unable to prevent a theft accomplished through cunning rather than force, a vulnerability his whole existence as a warrior and a shadow had never been shaped to anticipate or defend against. The stolen fragment did not vanish harmlessly into obscurity. It became the instrument of Godwyn's death, a death unlike any other death the lands between had known before. For Destined Death, once stolen and unleashed, does not merely end a life. It ends it in truth, severing a soul from any hope of the incomplete and lingering existence most deaths in the lands between allow. Godwyn's soul was destroyed outright, his body left to persist without it. A horror made possible only because the power meant to prevent such total endings had, for one terrible night, slipped free of the guardian sworn to contain it. There is a bitter precision in how this theft turned Maliketh's own greatest strength against him. He had won Destined Death through the direct application of overwhelming force, a strength no rival had matched since the fall of the Gloam-Eyed Queen, but a guardian shaped so thoroughly around strength and open confrontation makes for a poor defense against theft accomplished through subtlety instead, a vulnerability that had nothing to do with how hard Maliketh could strike, and everything to do with whether anyone could slip past his vigilance unnoticed in the first place. The very qualities that made him unbeatable in open battle offered no protection at all against an enemy clever enough to avoid battle entirely. This is perhaps the cruelest lesson any guardian can learn, that strength sufficient to conquer is not the same strength required to guard, that the two demand different virtues entirely, and that a warrior who has mastered the first may still find himself wholly unprepared for the second. Maliketh's whole existence had been shaped around discipline and restraint, around holding a beast's ferocity in check, so that it might be unleashed with devastating precision when the moment demanded it. None of that discipline, however complete, could answer a threat that never gave him the chance to unleash anything at all. There is a further irony worth marking in how this theft unfolded, one that touches on the very nature of the trust Maliketh had placed in his own vigilance. A guardian who watches for enemies from without cannot easily guard against a scheme that moves through channels. His outward-facing discipline was never built to monitor. Plots laid by minds clever enough to work at a remove from any confrontation his strength might have answered face to face. Whoever orchestrated the theft that stole a fragment of Destined Death understood something Maliketh's whole nature as a warrior had left him poorly equipped to anticipate, that the surest way past an unbeatable guardian is to ensure the fight never comes, rather than to fight him at all. The way to failure. The theft on the night of Black Knives left Maliketh carrying a failure that struck at the very core of his purpose, a wound no victory in open battle could ever hope to heal. For a being whose entire existence had been shaped around a single unwavering task, the failure of that task cuts deeper than any wound a blade might leave. Maliketh had not merely lost a battle, an outcome any warrior might, in time, suffer and recover from and renewed resolve. He had failed the one purpose his whole existence had been bound to since Marika first claimed him as her shadow, the single task that gave meaning to every sacrifice his discipline and his devotion had ever demanded of him. A guardian who fails the one thing he exists to guard carries a burden no ordinary defeat could ever match. There is a particular cruelty in how this failure came about, one that must have weighed upon Maliketh, with a bitterness few other setbacks in his long existence could rival. He had proven himself against a foe capable of slaying gods, a triumph that should, by any reasonable measure, have marked him as unassailable in the one duty that mattered most. And yet, it was not strength that undid his guardianship, not some rival warrior bold enough to challenge him in the manner the Gloam-Eyed Queen once had. It was scheme and shadow. A theft that required no confrontation his strength could have answered, only a cunning his whole nature as a warrior had never been built to anticipate. There is a particular loneliness worth imagining in the aftermath of such a discovery. A guardian realizing, in the quiet hours after the theft was found, that the one purpose his entire existence had been shaped around had slipped through his grasp while he stood, by every measure of martial strength, undefeated. No enemy had bested him in combat. No rival had proven bold enough to test his strength face to face. And still, Destined Death had been taken. A failure that could not be answered by any renewed show of force, for the weakness that allowed it had nothing to do with strength at all. What comfort might a warrior find in victories still unmatched, when the one failure that mattered most had already occurred despite them? This realization must have carried Maliketh toward a reckoning with the very nature of what guardianship required. A reckoning that strength alone, however formidable, could never again be trusted as sufficient protection for the power he had sworn to hold. Whatever confidence his long, unbroken vigilance before this night had built within him, the theft dismantled it entirely, replacing a guardian's quiet assurance with a knowledge far harder to carry, that the one thing he existed to prevent could happen again, through means his strength alone would never see coming. There is a question worth sitting with in the quiet aftermath of this realization, one Maliketh himself must have wrestled with across whatever span of time passed, before he settled upon his next course of action. What does a guardian do, once he has learned that guardianship itself can be circumvented, that the very foundation of his purpose has proven less absolute than he had always believed it to be? Some, faced with such a discovery, might have redoubled their vigilance in the same form it had always taken, trusting that greater watchfulness alone could close whatever gap the theft had revealed. Maliketh, by every account the lands between preserves of what followed, chose a different and far more drastic path, one that would remove the very possibility of theft, rather than merely guard more closely against it. This failure would come to define the whole shape of Maliketh's existence across every age still to come, a wound that no subsequent victory or continued vigilance could ever undo in whole. He had proven, in the worst possible way, that even the most formidable guardian carries vulnerabilities his own strength cannot see or defend against, a lesson learned at a cost no guardian should ever have had to pay. Whatever grief and whatever fury Maliketh carried in the wake of this discovery, however sharply the loss of Godwyn's soul must have weighed upon a shadow who had already, in some fashion, failed his queen once, the path he chose next asked something of himself no ordinary guardian would ever willingly consider. It was not enough, he seems to have decided, to watch more closely over a blade that could still be reached by hands clever enough to find it. The blade itself would have to become something no hand, however cunning, could ever hope to reach again. What Maliketh chose to do with this knowledge, the drastic and irreversible step he took to ensure such a theft could never again succeed, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow we sit with the flesh-made vessel, the terrible choice Maliketh made to seal the black blade within his own body forever. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sit with the flesh-made vessel, the terrible choice Maliketh made to seal the black blade within his own body forever. Having learned that no vigilance, however unbroken, could guarantee destined death against a theft cunning enough to slip past open strength, Maliketh chose a solution more drastic than any guardian before him had ever attempted. He would no longer merely carry the black blade that held the power of destined death within its edge. He would become its vessel, binding the blade so wholly into his own body that to steal it Any hand would first have to end his life outright. Tonight we sit with the flesh-made vessel, the terrible choice Maliketh made to seal the black blade within his own body forever. Tonight we sit with the flesh-made vessel, the terrible choice Maliketh made to seal the black blade within his own body forever. A blade no longer separate. In the aftermath of the theft, Maliketh bound the black blade within his own flesh, ensuring that Destined Death could never again be taken from him while he yet lived. The choice Maliketh made after the theft on the night of Black Knives was not a matter of sharpening his vigilance or doubling whatever guard he had once kept over the blade. It was something far more absolute. He bound the black blade, the weapon that carried the whole power of Destined Death within its edge, into his own flesh, sealing it so wholly into his own body that the blade ceased to exist as a separate object a thief might ever hope to locate and steal. Where once a determined enough hand had found a way to slip past his guard, now there was nothing to slip past at all, for the blade itself no longer sat apart from him, waiting to be found. This is no mere figure of speech. When Maliketh draws the black blade in battle, he draws it from his own body, the weapon emerging from his own flesh, as though flesh and steel had become, through this act of binding, all but indistinguishable from one another. The blade that once harbored the power of Destined Death openly, carried at his side like any warrior's weapon, became instead something drawn from within himself, a part of his own being rather than an instrument he merely wielded. There is something worth pausing on in the visual reality of this transformation, in what it must have meant for any witness, fortunate or unfortunate. Enough to see Maliketh draw his weapon for the first time after the sealing. A warrior reaching for a sword at his hip is a familiar sight, ordinary and unremarkable in its mechanics, even when the sword itself carries extraordinary power. A warrior drawing a blade from his own flesh is something else entirely, a sight that announces, without any need for further explanation, that the being standing before you has surrendered the ordinary boundary between body and weapon that every other warrior in the lands between still maintains. To witness this act was to understand in an instant that Maliketh's devotion to his purpose had carried him somewhere few other beings would ever willingly follow. The security this arrangement offered was, in its own terrible way, absolute. So long as Maliketh lived, no thief, however cunning, however patient, could ever hope to repeat what had been accomplished on the night of Black Knives. There was no blade to find hidden in some vault or chamber, no weapon left unguarded during some unwatched hour. Destined Death now existed nowhere except within Maliketh himself, a security purchased not through greater vigilance, but through the complete erasure of any gap vigilance alone might have left open. There is a particular kind of ingenuity worth recognizing in this solution, however terrible its implications for Maliketh's own existence. Where an ordinary guardian, chastened by failure, might have only moved the treasure to a more remote and better guarded location, or surrounded it with additional layers of defense and deception, Maliketh reasoned towards something far more radical, that the only unbreachable defense in any real sense was to eliminate the separation between guardian and treasure entirely. A vault, however deep, can still be found and breached given enough time and enough cunning. A power bound within a living body, sustained only by that body's continued life, admits of no such patient siege. To reach it, an enemy must do the one thing no thief on the night of Black Knives had dared attempt: face Maliketh in the open, with no scheme or shadow to shield them from his strength. This solution, however drastic, followed a certain grim logic from everything the theft had already taught him. If cunning alone had proven sufficient to circumvent his open strength, then the only answer was to remove cunning's advantage entirely, forcing any future attempt to pass through the one gate his strength had already proven itself equal to defending. Open confrontation with Maliketh himself. What was lost in the sealing? The black blade, once sealed within Maliketh's flesh, lost something of its former glory, its power diminished by the very act that made it secure. Security of this kind did not come without cost. The black blade, once a weapon whose power was spoken of in terms that placed it among the most fearsome instruments in the whole of the lands between, became, in the act of its sealing, something diminished, a shadow of the glory it had carried when Maliketh first claimed it from the fallen Gloam-Eyed Queen. What had once burned with the true and terrible power to slay gods now existed in a lesser form, its fullest strength apparently bound as tightly by the sealing as its physical form was bound to Maliketh's own body. This diminishment reveals something important about the nature of the trade Maliketh made. He did not merely hide the blade more successfully while leaving its power untouched. The very act of binding it so wholly into his own flesh appears to have cost the weapon something of its original nature, as though a power meant to be wielded openly could not be folded into such intimate concealment without some portion of its strength being lost in the folding. The black blade that emerges from Maliketh's hand in battle is real and formidable still, but it is not, by every account that survives to compare the two, the same blade that once cut down an Empyrean capable of slaying gods. There is a particular sacrifice worth recognizing in this trade. One Maliketh appears to have accepted without hesitation despite its cost. He surrendered the fullest measure of the blade's own power, a diminishment that must have been plain to him even as he undertook the sealing, in exchange for a security no thief could ever again breach. Whatever pride a warrior might ordinarily take in wielding a weapon at the height of its strength, Maliketh set that pride aside entirely, choosing certainty over glory, security over the fullest expression of the very power he had once fought so hard to claim. There is something worth dwelling on in the particular grief of watching a hard-won treasure diminish through the very act meant to protect it. A grief distinct from the grief of losing something outright. Had the black blade been stolen entirely and lost to him forever, Maliketh might have grieved a clean and total loss, the kind of wound that, however painful, admits of no ongoing reminder. Instead, he chose a slower and quieter diminishment, keeping the blade close but never again in the form that had once made it the terror of gods, a daily reminder every time he drew it in battle of just what the theft on the night of Black Knives had cost him, even in his own act of preventing its recurrence. This is perhaps the truest measure of what devotion asks of those who carry it furthest. Not a single dramatic sacrifice made once and left behind, but an ongoing diminishment carried forward across every remaining age of one's existence, felt anew each time the reduced blade answers. A call the full and unbound weapon might once have answered with far greater terror. Sikis Kalichums Kansi. A guardian who is the vessel. By sealing the black blade within himself, Maliketh transformed his own existence from that of a guardian standing watch over Destined Death into something closer to its living container. There is a profound shift in what Maliketh became through this act, one that reaches beyond mere strategy into the very nature of his existence. Before the sealing, he had been a guardian in the ordinary sense, a warrior charged with protecting something that existed apart from himself, however closely bound his duty to it might have been. After the sealing, this separation ceased to exist, Maliketh did not merely guard Destined Death any longer. He had become, in the most literal sense, the lands between could offer, its living vessel, the power no longer merely his charge, but a genuine part of his own body and being. This transformation carries a weight that mere guardianship never demanded of him. A guardian who fails can, at least in principle, recover from that failure, standing watch with renewed attention in the future over a treasure that remains, in its essential nature, separate from himself. A vessel who fails offers no such possibility of recovery, for failure now means his own death, the only circumstance under which Destined Death could ever again be separated from him and claimed by another. Maliketh had raised the price of theft to its highest point. He had made his own continued existence the sole remaining barrier between Destined Death and whatever hand might one day seek to claim it. There is a haunting symmetry worth naming here, one the lands between itself would only reveal across the ages still to come. Maliketh's whole purpose in becoming Destined Death's vessel was to ensure that no theft could ever again unbind the power he guarded. And yet, in binding it so wholly to his own life, he created a new and single path by which that same unbinding could still occur, not theft, but his own defeat in open battle. He had closed one door only to leave another standing, a door that could be opened not by cunning, but by the same overwhelming strength he had once wielded to claim the power in the first place, turned now against him, rather than in his service. Whether Maliketh himself ever recognized this symmetry, that his solution to theft had merely exchanged one vulnerability for another, the surviving record does not say. What is certain is that this new vulnerability would, in an age still far distant from the sealing itself, prove every bit as consequential as the theft it was designed to prevent, when a wanderer strong enough to defeat him at last stood before the guardian who had made his own body the final seal upon Destined Death. And there is something worth pausing on in what this transformation asked of Maliketh's own sense of self. To become a vessel is to accept a diminishment of one's own independence, a binding of one's own fate so wholly to a single purpose that the two can no longer be separated even in principle. Whatever remained of Maliketh, apart from his role as guardian of Destined Death, grew smaller with this act. His own existence folded ever more tightly into the single purpose Marika had first set before him. There is a final thought worth carrying forward from this transformation, one that touches on the deepest question this whole story has asked from its very beginning. What remains of a being who binds himself so wholly to a single purpose that purpose and self can no longer be told apart? Maliketh had already surrendered much of his own wild nature to the discipline his service as Marika's shadow demanded. In sealing the black blade within his own flesh, he surrendered something further still, the last remaining distinction between the guardian and the thing he guarded, becoming, in the truest sense, indistinguishable from the purpose that had first defined him. Perhaps this is what it means to serve with the whole of oneself, rather than merely with one strength or one skill, to accept, in the end, that the line between the servant and the service can grow so thin that neither can be spoken of without the other. Maliketh entered his mother's household as a shadow, a role that already asked him to define himself in relation to another, rather than in his own right. In sealing the blade within his own body, he completed a journey that role had set him upon from the very beginning, arriving at last at a form of existence in which nothing of himself remained wholly separate from the purpose he had sworn, so long ago, to serve. Whatever he had once been, before three wolves knelt in prayer beneath a primordial ring, that earlier self had, by this point, all but vanished into the vessel he had chosen to become. What this transformation would come to cost him, as grief and betrayal mounted in the ages still to come, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow we sit with grief and exile, the death of Godwyn and the fall of the Golden Order that drove Maliketh from Marika's side. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sit with grief and exile, the death of Godwyn and the fall of the Golden Order that drove Maliketh from Marika's side. Maliketh had given nearly everything a being could give in service of Marika's design, his freedom, his independence, the whole of his body sealed into a vessel for a power he could never again set aside. What remained to him was a nephew and an order, the two threads still tying him to some sense of family and purpose beyond his own solitary vigilance. When both were taken from him within the span of the same terrible age, Maliketh chose at last to vanish from Marika's side entirely. Tonight we sit with grief and exile, the death of Godwyn and the fall of the Golden Order that drove Maliketh from Marika's side. Tonight we sit with grief and exile, the death of Godwyn and the fall of the Golden Order that drove Maliketh from Marika's side. A nephew lost to the power he guarded. Godwyn's death, brought about by the very fragment of Destined Death stolen from Maliketh's own keeping, struck at a wound already raw with the failure of his guardianship. This channel has already told the fuller story of Godwyn, the demigod whose soul was destroyed outright on the night of Black Knives, his body left to persist in a horror unlike any other death the lands between had known. What matters here, for Maliketh's own story, is the particular cruelty of his relation to that loss. Godwyn was not merely another casualty of a plot Maliketh had failed to prevent. He was family, a nephew whose death came at the hands of the very power Maliketh had sworn his whole existence to guard, stolen from his own keeping and turned against his own kin. There is a grief distinct from ordinary loss in discovering that one's own failure made a loved one's death possible, a grief that folds sorrow and guilt into a single inseparable wound. Maliketh had already carried, since the theft itself, the burden of having failed the one purpose his existence was built around. Godwyn's death transformed that abstract failure into something far more personal and far harder to set aside. A nephew's destruction that traced back, however indirectly, to the guardian who had let the power that destroyed him slip free, however briefly, from his own keeping. There is a particular weight worth imagining in what it must have meant for Maliketh to learn the specific manner of Godwyn's death, to understand that the very fragment he had failed to protect had become the instrument used against his own kin. This was not a nephew lost to illness, or to some ordinary danger of the lands between, against which no guardian could reasonably have been expected to protect him. Godwyn died by a power Maliketh alone, among all the beings in the lands between, had been charged with keeping from ever reaching such a use. The line between his failure and his nephew's death was as direct as any line could be drawn, offering him no comfortable distance from which to grieve. And there is a further cruelty in the timing of this discovery, arriving as it did after Maliketh had already sealed the black blade within his own flesh, believing he had done everything within his power to ensure such a theft could never happen again. He learned of Godwyn's death not before his drastic response, but by every account the lands between preserves, in the wake of it, a guardian who had already paid an enormous price to secure Destined Death against future theft, only to discover that the damage from the theft already committed could never be undone by any security he built afterward. Whatever comfort Maliketh might have drawn from his drastic response, the sealing of the black blade within his own flesh that ensured no further theft could ever repeat what had already been done. That comfort could do nothing to undo the loss already suffered. The sealing prevented a second theft. It could not restore what the first had already claimed. Godwyn remained lost, his soul destroyed beyond any hope of recovery, a grief Maliketh would carry forward, regardless of how thoroughly he had since secured the power that caused it. The order he built now breaking. Alongside the grief of Godwyn's loss, Maliketh watched the whole golden order he had sacrificed so much to help found begin to shatter, a collapse this channel has told in fuller detail elsewhere. The fall of the Golden Order, the great rebellion that would come to be remembered as the Shattering, belongs to a story this channel has already followed at length. Marika's own hammer breaking the Elden Ring, the great runes scattering, the demigods who had once stood as siblings turning against one another in a war for the fragments left behind. For Maliketh, watching this collapse unfold carried a weight distinct from whatever grief the wider lands between felt at the ending of an age. He had given his whole existence to help secure the foundation upon which this order rested, sealing Destined Death away so that the Golden Order's particular kind of peace could take root and flourish across the ages that followed. To watch that same order tear itself apart from within, undone by the very rebellion of the god who had built it, rather than by any external enemy, was to watch the whole purpose of his sacrifice called into question. What had his guardianship secured? If the order it was meant to protect could still collapse through causes entirely beyond his power to guard against. He had spent himself entirely on a single narrow task, believing that task essential to something larger and more enduring than himself. The shattering revealed that even flawless guardianship of Destined Death could not save the Golden Order from the deeper fractures already running through its own foundation. There is a bitter lesson embedded in this collapse, one that must have cut Maliketh especially hard, given everything he had already surrendered to prevent just this kind of unraveling. He had believed, or had chosen to believe, that securing Destined Death was the essential foundation upon which the Golden Order's stability rested, a belief that gave meaning to every sacrifice his guardianship had demanded of him. The shattering exposed this belief as, at best, incomplete. Destined Death had remained secure throughout, sealed within his own flesh, just as he had intended, and still the whole order collapsed regardless, undone by rivalries and rebellions his particular vigilance had never been positioned to prevent. This revelation must have carried a particular sting for a being who had already surrendered so much in service of a single purpose. If his guardianship, however perfectly executed, could not prevent the order's fall, then what had the whole of his sacrifice really secured? The question admits no comfortable answer, and there is no record of Maliketh ever finding one that satisfied him. This double blow, a nephew lost to the very power he guarded, and an order collapsing despite everything his guardianship had secured, left Maliketh facing a grief with no clear object left to direct it toward. He could not undo Godwyn's death by any renewed vigilance. He could not halt the shattering by any strength his blade still carried. Both losses had already occurred by forces his particular devotion had never been built to answer, leaving him to carry the weight of both without any action left available that might have addressed either. There is a particular helplessness worth sitting with in this position, one distinct from the helplessness of facing an ongoing threat that at least offers some future action to take against it. A guardian confronting a rival still to come can prepare, can sharpen, can ready himself for whatever confrontation the future holds. A guardian confronting two losses already suffered, with no remaining action capable of reversing either, faces a different and in some ways harder trial. The discovery that grief, once the harm has already been done, has nowhere left to go but inward, with no outward task remaining to absorb it. A devotion no longer answered. Recall the quiet warning offered at the very beginning of this story, that even in choosing Maliketh for her purpose, Marika would, in the end, betray him. In grief and in the ruin of the order he had served, that betrayal found its fullest shape. The betrayal hinted at so early in Maliketh's story finds its clearest expression in these ruinous ages. Though the lands between never records a single dramatic act of treachery to point toward, it was, instead, a betrayal of accumulation, the slow revelation that a devotion given without reservation had never been matched by a corresponding regard for what that devotion cost the one who gave it. Marika had needed a vessel, and Maliketh had become one entirely, surrendering his independence, his body, and at the last, watching his nephew and his order fall, regardless of everything that surrender had purchased. There is no record of Marika offering Maliketh comfort in the wake of Godwyn's death. No gesture that suggests she recognized what her shadow had sacrificed on behalf of a design that was, in the end, her own to abandon, when her own rebellion shattered the ring she had once fought so hard to complete. Whatever bond of half-sibling kinship had first drawn Maliketh into her service, it offered him no particular shelter when the order he had bled for began to collapse at his own sister's hand. He had given himself as a vessel for her purpose. When that purpose turned against itself, he found himself with no purpose of his own left to hold on to. There is a particular loneliness worth naming in this silence, one that speaks to the whole shape of the bond between shadow and Empyrean this story began with. A shadow, by its very nature, exists in relation to the one who casts it, its whole significance defined by that relationship, rather than by anything independent of it. When Marika's own actions, her rebellion, and the ensuing collapse of the order she had built called that very relationship into question, Maliketh found himself without any clear footing left to stand upon. He was still, in some technical sense, her shadow. But the Queen, whose light had once given that shadow its shape and its meaning, had, through her own choices, thrown the whole arrangement into a darkness neither of them had prepared for. Whatever loyalty Maliketh still carried toward Marika in these ruinous ages, it could no longer draw upon the same clarity of purpose that had once defined his service so wholly. A shadow cast by a light that has itself grown uncertain finds its own shape growing uncertain in turn, and Maliketh, whatever devotion still bound him to his sister and queen, faced these ages with a purpose far less settled than the one that had once sent him hunting a god-slaying rival on her behalf. This is perhaps the truest shape of the betrayal the record hints at from Maliketh's very beginning. A quiet and accumulating discovery, rather than a single sharp act of treachery. That total devotion, however faithfully given, guarantees nothing in return, not gratitude, not protection, not even the preservation of the very order that devotion was meant to secure. There is something worth marking in the particular direction Maliketh's response took, once grief and disillusionment had done their full work upon him. He did not turn against Marika outright, nor did he join whatever rebellion or resistance might have offered him some outlet for the bitterness such a betrayal might reasonably have provoked. He withdrew instead, choosing absence over confrontation, exile over accusation. Whatever anger he carried toward the sister and queen who had let him bear so much while offering so little in return, he chose to carry it in silence, vanishing from the ruins of the order he had helped build, rather than remaining to demand whatever reckoning his sacrifice might have justly deserved. This choice reveals something enduring about the character discipline had carved into him across every age of his service. A being less thoroughly shaped by restraint might have turned bitterness into open rebellion, joining whatever faction sought to challenge Marika's remaining authority, or lashing out at the order that had failed to honor what he had given it. Maliketh chose silence and disappearance instead, a final act of restraint that mirrored the very discipline he had spent his whole existence perfecting, even as that discipline now served no purpose but to carry him away from everything he had once fought so hard to protect. What Maliketh chose to do with this discovery, the disguise he took up, and the long exile that followed, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow, we sit with the beast clergyman, the humble guise Maliketh wore to hide from a world that had cost him everything. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we sit with the beast clergyman, the humble guise Maliketh wore to hide from a world that had cost him everything. In his exile from Marika's fallen order, Maliketh did not vanish from the lands between entirely. He took up a humbler guise, hiding the shadow he had become beneath the tattered robes of a clergyman, dwelling among beasts in a sanctum far from the golden halls he had once served. There, known to nearly everyone who crossed his path only as Gurranq, he pursued a hope that would, in the end, prove as hollow as the order he had left behind. Tonight we sit with the beast clergyman, the humble guise Maliketh wore to hide from a world that had cost him everything. Tonight we sit with the beast clergyman, the humble guise Maliketh wore to hide from a world that had cost him everything. A guise among the beasts. Maliketh took up the identity of Gurranq, the beast clergyman, dwelling in the bestial sanctum of Caelid, a role that returned him, in a strange way, to origins far older than his service to Marika. Wherever exile carried Maliketh in the ages after Godwyn's death and the Golden Order's collapse, he came at last to settle beneath a guise far removed from the shadow, who had once hunted a god-slaying queen at Marika's command. As Gurranq, the beast clergyman, he dwelt in the bestial sanctum of Caelid, presenting himself to any who found him as little more than a beast, robed in a clergyman's tattered garments, his true nature and his true history hidden entirely beneath this humbler identity. Few who encountered Gurranq in this age would ever have guessed that the creature before them had once claimed Destined Death from the fallen Gloam-Eyed Queen. There is a fitting circularity in the particular guise Maliketh chose, one that returns his story to the very origins glimpsed in the ancient shrine that would, in time, mark his final resting place. Recall the statues depicting 3 wolves attending a young Empyrean in prayer, a scene from ages before his binding to Marika ever began. Gurranq's own history, by every account the lands between preserves, reaches back to a culture of beastmen who worshipped the great stone dragons in an age long before the Erdtree ever rose to prominence. Devotees who guarded sacred places and served gods far older than the Golden Order Maliketh had spent so many ages defending. In taking up this guise, Maliketh did not merely hide. He returned, however unconsciously, to something closer to his own beginnings. This return carries its own quiet poignancy. A being who had spent so long shaped by discipline and service to a queen's design now wrapped himself once more in the trappings of a much older devotion, one that predated Marika's order by ages beyond easy counting. Whether Maliketh chose this particular guise deliberately, seeking some comfort in origins older than the betrayal that had driven him into exile, or whether circumstance alone carried him back toward this ancient identity, the lands between leaves unanswered. What is certain is that Gurranq, Beast Clergyman, was no invented mask, but a genuine return to something Maliketh had carried within himself since long before Marika ever claimed him as her shadow. There is a further layer worth considering in what this return meant for Maliketh's own sense of self. Across his long service to Marika, his whole identity had been defined by his relationship to her, a shadow existing in reference to the light that cast it. In taking up Gurranq's identity, he set that relationship aside, at least outwardly, presenting himself instead in terms of a far older devotion that owed nothing to Marika or her fallen order. Whether this offered him any genuine relief from the grief and betrayal he carried, or whether the guise merely gave him somewhere to hide that grief rather than resolve it, the Lands Between never says outright. And yet, there is something telling in the particular company Maliketh chose for his exile. Beasts and beast worship, rather than any human court or council that might have offered him standing and recognition. A being stripped of the purpose that had once given his existence its clearest shape, found himself drawn, whether by choice or by instinct, back toward the wolves and the wild devotion that had marked his origins long before any queen ever claimed him as her own. The hunger for Deathroot. As Gurranq, Maliketh sought a single substance above all else, Deathroot, the source of those who live on in death, hoping its consumption might undo the curse that had claimed his nephew. Those who sought out Gurranq in his sanctum found a clergyman with a single, unwavering request. Bring him Deathroot, wherever it could be found, and he would teach in return the bestial incantations his long knowledge of beast lore had preserved. Deathroot itself is bound up with the horror of those who live on in death, the creatures whose bodies persist without the true and final ending. Destined Death alone can grant, a phenomenon that traces its origin back to the very theft that had shaped the whole of Maliketh's exile. To consume Deathroot, for Gurranq, was to consume a fragment of the very curse he had spent his existence trying to contain. The hope driving this hunger reached towards something intensely personal. However, the Lands Between rarely states it outright. Gurranq's hunger for Deathroot carried within it a hope of ending Godwyn's curse, the horror of a nephew's body persisting without the soul that had once animated it, a lingering wound from the very theft Maliketh had failed to prevent. Every fragment of Deathroot he consumed represented, however small a portion of the whole, a chance that this particular horror might at last be undone, that some measure of the loss he carried since the Night of Black Knives might yet find some form of remedy. There is a symbolism worth marking in this hunger that reaches back to the theft itself. Just as a fragment of Destined Death was once stolen from Maliketh's keeping, setting loose the horror that claimed Godwyn, so too did Gurranq now seek fragments of a related power, Deathroot, hoping that gathering enough of them might somehow answer or undo what the original theft had unleashed. It was, in its way, an attempt to run the original tragedy backward, collecting rather than losing, hoping that enough gathering might counterbalance what one terrible theft had once taken from him. Artheta never sated. Every fragment of Deathroot Gurranq consumed left him wanting more, an endless hunger that mirrored, in its own way, the wound the theft on the Night of Black Knives had first opened within him. Those who served Gurranq across the ages found that no quantity of Deathroot ever satisfied his hunger for it. Long before the Tarnished ever found their way to his sanctum, another had already taken up this same duty. D, Hunter of the Dead, who laboured at Gurranq's service, weeding Deathroot from wherever it could be found across the Lands Between. When D's own path later carried him elsewhere, he found a Tarnished willing to take up the same task in his place, continuing a service that had, by that point, already stretched across far longer than either servant could have anticipated when they first began. This endless hunger reveals something essential about the nature of what Gurranq was really seeking. Deathroot alone, however much of it he consumed, could never answer in whole the loss that drove him to seek it, for no accumulation of fragments could undo a theft and a death that had already, in their fullest sense, already occurred and could not be reversed by any later gathering, however patient or however thorough. Gurranq's hunger was not, in the end, a hunger any quantity of deathroot could satisfy, for what he sought, in the end, was something no root or fragment could ever restore to him. His nephew's soul, whole and undamaged, as it had been before the theft that stole it away. And yet he continued to ask for more, across ages and across servants, each new fragment of deathroot received with the same eagerness as the last, as though this time, perhaps, enough might at last have been gathered to answer what all the previous fragments together had failed to achieve. There is a particular tragedy in hope sustained this way, a hunger that persists not because satisfaction seems within honest reach, but because the alternative, accepting that no amount of gathering could ever undo what was lost, was a truth Gurranq was, for a long while, unwilling or unable to face. There is something worth recognizing in how long this particular denial sustained itself, spanning the service of at least two different servants across an unmeasured span of ages. D, Hunter of the Dead, labored at this task without ever witnessing its resolution, passing the burden onward before any answer had been found, that the Tarnished would be the one to, at last, exhaust the last available deathroot, bringing Gurranq's long search to its inevitable and unsatisfying conclusion, speaks to how patient and how thorough this particular denial had to be to sustain itself across so vast a stretch of failed attempts. Hope of this kind does not collapse easily. It requires, instead, the exhaustion of every last possibility before the truth it has been avoiding can be permitted, at last, to surface. The recognition of futility, when at last enough deathroot had been gathered and delivered, Gurranq came to a realization he had perhaps avoided facing for ages, that his hunger could never be answered, and that his whole long labor had been pursuing an ending that did not exist. The moment came at last, after the Tarnished had delivered every fragment of deathroot the lands. Between still held, when Gurranq's long-sustained hope collapsed beneath the weight of its own accumulated failures. Having received all the deathroot he could ever hope to gather, he found himself no closer to undoing Godwyn's curse than he had been at the very beginning of his long and patient hunger. The realization that followed was stark and by every account devastating. His whole labor across so many ages, across so many servants who had aided him in the gathering, had pursued an ending that never existed to be found. Despondent, Gurranq recognized at last that he had done all he could for the lands between, that no further gathering of deathroot would ever bring him closer to the remedy he had spent so long seeking. He departed his sanctum in this recognition, leaving behind the role and the hope that had sustained his long exile, carrying forward only his hunger as his sole remaining companion, a hunger now stripped of the belief that had once made it feel, however falsely, like a hunger capable of being satisfied. There is a particular dignity worth marking in how this recognition unfolded, one that sets Gurranq's grief apart from mere despair. He did not rage against the servants who had brought him deathroot, without ever restoring what he sought, did not blame the Tarnished or Hunter of the Dead, for a failure that belonged, in truth, to the impossible nature of the hope itself, rather than to any shortcoming in their service. He accepted instead that the fault lay in the hope, not in those who had helped him pursue it, a quiet grace that echoes the same discipline and restraint that had marked Maliketh's whole existence long before Gurranq's sanctum ever gave him shelter. This acceptance carries within it a wisdom hard won across ages of fruitless searching, one that few beings, mortal or otherwise, ever managed to reach without first exhausting every possible avenue of denial. Gurranq did not settle for false comfort, did not pretend that the death root gathered had accomplished more than it really had. He faced the plain truth of his failure and departed rather than continuing to demand more from a hope that had already proven itself empty, a bitter but honest reckoning with the limits of what any amount of devoted searching could ever hope to achieve. This departure marks a turning point in Maliketh's long story, the moment his exile's central purpose, however quietly pursued, revealed itself as a hope that could never have succeeded. What remained for him, once this particular hope had been exhausted, was the older and more terrible purpose he had carried since long before Gurranq's sanctum ever gave him shelter, the guardianship of Destined Death, and the confrontation still waiting for him at the ruined heights of Crumbling Farum Azula. There is something fitting in how this chapter of Maliketh's story closes. A guise shed at last, once the hope it was built to shelter had proven itself impossible to fulfill. He had spent an age hiding within a devotion older than his queen's order, hoping that patient gathering might undo what a single terrible theft had once broken. That hope failed him, as perhaps it always must have, but the failure itself carried its own quiet clarity, stripping away whatever illusion remained and leaving him at last with nothing but the older purpose that had defined him from the very beginning. What became of Maliketh? Once his disguise as the beast clergyman could no longer sustain him, and the ancient culture of dragon worship his own history was bound to, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow, we sit with the Guardian at Farum Azula, and the final role Maliketh would come to play in a story far older than his service to Marika. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we sit with the Guardian at Farum Azula, and the final role Maliketh would come to play in a story far older than his service to Marika. When Gurranq's long hunger at last proved itself unanswerable, Maliketh did not merely vanish into further exile. He returned, in the end, to the very site his own oldest history was bound to, the ancient ruined sanctum of Crumbling Farum Azula, where a shrine to beasts and dragons far older than the Golden Order still stands, waiting for the Guardian who would make his final stand there. Tonight we sit with the Guardian at Farum Azula, and the final role Maliketh would come to play in a story far older than his service to Marika. Tonight we sit with the Guardian at Farum Azula, and the final role Maliketh would come to play in a story far older than his service to Marika. Return to the ancient shrine. The ruined sanctum atop Crumbling Farum Azula, where Maliketh makes his final stand, is the very same shrine depicted in the statues glimpsed at the beginning of this story. 3 wolves attending a young Empyrean in prayer. Recall the ancient shrine described at the very beginning of this story. Its statues depicting 3 wolves attending a young Empyrean, kneeling in prayer beneath the glowing image of a primordial Elden ring. That shrine is no separate location, remembered only in passing reference. It is the very sanctum atop Crumbling Farum Azula, where Maliketh makes his final stand. The same ground where his story began now serving as the ground where it will, at last, come to its ending. Whatever else this long tale has followed across so many ages and so many transformations, it closes precisely where it opened, a circle drawn across a span of time few other stories in the lands between could match. This is no mere coincidence of geography. To return to Farum Azula is to return to the very origins the shrine's carved wolves and prayerful Empyrean first hinted at, a homecoming of sorts for a being who had spent so many ages defined by roles given to him by others. Marika's shadow, the guardian of Destined Death, the humble Gurranq hiding among beasts. In this final confrontation, Maliketh stands once more upon the ground that shaped him before any of those roles ever claimed him. Meeting whatever fate awaits him in the same sacred place, his existence first took its earliest recorded shape. There is a quiet symmetry worth marking in how this circle closes, one that reaches beyond mere sentiment into something closer to structural inevitability. Every guardian, however far his duties carry him from where he began, must at some point stand somewhere, and it seems fitting, in retrospect, that Maliketh's standing ground should be the very place his story opened. The lands between rarely grants its figures such tidy circles, most stories ending in places their beginnings never anticipated, scattered across battlefields and ruins far removed from wherever their first chapter unfolded. That Maliketh's story closes precisely where it opened marks his tale as something rarer, a life that returns, in its final hour, to the exact ground that first shaped it. Whatever the tarnished who reaches this shrine understands of its deeper history, whether they recognize the wolves and the kneeling Empyrean as anything more than old and weathered stone, the shrine itself carries the whole weight of everything this story has followed. Every choice Maliketh made, every sacrifice his devotion demanded of him, culminates upon the same ground where three wolves once knelt in prayer beneath a primordial ring, a final confrontation staged, whether by design or by circumstance, at the one place in the whole of the lands between most fitting for it to unfold. There is a particular fittingness in a story that ends where it began, especially for a being whose whole existence was so thoroughly defined by service to purposes not entirely his own. Whatever Maliketh was before three wolves knelt in prayer beneath that ancient ring, whatever he became across his service to Marika and his long exile as Gurranq, his final stand returns him to the one place in the whole of the lands between that belonged, in some sense, to him before anyone else ever laid claim to what he would become. The age of dragons and the beastmen. Long before the Erdtree rose to prominence, an age of stone dragons ruled the lands between, served by beast people granted intelligence to worship and guard their masters' sacred places, a culture Maliketh's own history reaches back into. The shrine at Farum Azula belongs to an age far older than the Golden Order, a time when great stone dragons ruled the lands between and beasts, granted intelligence by the greater will, evolved into beast people devoted to serving and worshipping these ancient masters. These beastmen guarded the sacred places their draconic lords claimed as their own, places of ancient power scattered across the lands between that looked nothing like the golden and ordered realm the coming ages would build atop its foundations. Farum Azula itself stood among the most sacred of these sites, a place bound so closely to the age of dragons that even the ravages of every later era have never entirely erased what it once was. Gurranq's own bearing offers hints of a place within this ancient hierarchy. The high rank his weapon and his manner suggest, a clergyman armed and adorned in ways that mark him as no common beast, points toward a figure who may have held genuine standing within the culture of dragon worship that once claimed Farum Azula as sacred ground. If this reading holds true, then Maliketh's history reaches back further than even his binding to Marika ever suggested. A beastman clergyman who may have witnessed the fall of the Age of Dragons itself before whatever circumstance carried him into Marika's service as her shadow. There is a poignant thought worth sitting with in this possibility, one the Lands Between never confirms outright, but which the shrine's own imagery seems to invite. If Maliketh once served the dragons in whatever capacity his high rank suggests, then he was, before Marika ever entered his story, already a survivor of one age's ending, already familiar with the particular grief of watching a great and ancient order give way to something new. Whatever wisdom or whatever weariness he carried into his service as Marika's shadow may have owed something to this earlier loss, a being who had already learned once before what it meant to watch a world he had served pass into ruin. This deeper history recasts the whole of Maliketh's story in a fascinating light. He was not merely a beast Marika found and shaped into her shadow, a creature whose history began the moment she claimed him for her purpose. He carried, beneath that later role, an older devotion and an older culture entirely, one that predated the very golden order he would spend so many ages helping to found and to guard. Whatever loyalty he gave to Marika, it was given by a being who had already lived through the ending of one great age before ever committing himself to the building of another. The Guardian's final stand. At Farum Azula, Maliketh stands as the last barrier between the Tarnished and the power he has guarded across every age of his long existence, a confrontation that will, at last, put his vigilance to its final test. The battle that awaits any Tarnished bold enough to reach Farum Azula unfolds in two distinct movements, beginning with the beast clergyman still wearing the guise Gurranq had worn for so long, before giving way to Maliketh himself, the shadow and guardian revealed at last in his full and terrible form. This transformation, witnessed by whatever Tarnished proves strong enough to force it, marks the final shedding of the disguise that had sheltered Maliketh through his long exile, the humble clergyman falling away to reveal the warrior who once claimed Destined Death from a queen capable of slaying gods. This confrontation carries weight far beyond any ordinary battle, for Maliketh stands here not merely as an obstacle, but as the very embodiment of the guardianship this whole story has followed. Every choice he made, the hunt for the Gloam-Eyed Queen, the sealing of the black blade within his own flesh, the long exile and the futile hunger for Deathroot, converges upon this single confrontation. A guardian meeting at last, an opponent whose strength his vigilance has never before had to answer. Whatever the outcome, this battle represents the true and final test of everything Maliketh sacrificed his whole existence to secure. There is something worth honoring in how wholly Maliketh commits himself to this final confrontation. Whatever weariness or whatever grief he carries into it, he does not surrender the field, does not seek some final refuge to avoid the reckoning this battle represents. Whatever remains of the disciplined warrior who once defeated a god-slaying queen still answers the call this confrontation demands. A guardian meeting his final trial with the same unwavering commitment he brought to every duty Marika ever set before him, even now so far removed from her presence and from whatever remained of the order they once built together. And there is a particular courage worth marking in a guardian who fights on, knowing full well that his own defeat will accomplish the very thing his whole existence was shaped to prevent. Most warriors who understand that their death serves their enemy's purpose might reasonably seek to avoid that death by any means available. Maliketh does not flee this fate, does not abandon Farum Azula for some safer refuge where the confrontation might never come. He stands and fights, discharging his duty to the very last, even against an opponent whose victory he understands will unravel the whole of what his guardianship was meant to secure. There is a grim symmetry worth marking in how this confrontation unfolds. Maliketh sealed the Black Blade within his own body specifically to ensure that Destined Death could never again be stolen from him while he lived. He did not, and perhaps could not, guard as thoroughly against the possibility that his own death in open combat might accomplish precisely what theft alone once threatened. The Guardian who closed one door against thieves left, by the very nature of his solution, another door standing open to any warrior strong enough to defeat him outright. What his death unlocks. Should Maliketh fall, the rune of death he has guarded across every age of his long existence is unbound at last, unsealing the Erdtree itself and opening the path toward whatever destiny still awaits the tarnished. The consequences of Maliketh's fall reach far beyond the simple end of a single Guardian's long vigil. His defeat unbinds the rune of death, the very power he sealed within his own flesh so long ago, releasing Destined Death back into a world that has gone without it since the founding of the Golden Order. This unbinding, in turn, unseals the great thorned barrier that has kept the Erdtree closed against all who might otherwise have reached its roots. The black flame his fall releases burning away obstacles that no ordinary force could ever have hoped to breach. There is a bitter completeness in how thoroughly Maliketh's death serves the very purpose his life was spent guarding against. He gave everything, his independence, his body, his nephew's memory, his long and lonely exile, in service of keeping Destined Death contained. And in the end, it is his own fall, rather than any theft his careful sealing had rendered impossible, that returns this power, at last, to the world he spent so many ages protecting from it. The Guardian's death accomplishes what no thief, however cunning, was ever again permitted to achieve. There is a question worth sitting with in this bitter completeness, one that reaches back to the very warning offered at this story's beginning, that even in choosing Maliketh for her purpose, Marika would, in the end, betray him. Perhaps the truest shape of that betrayal lies not in any single act she committed against him, but in the very design of the guardianship itself, a purpose that could only ever end this way, with the Guardian's own death serving as the final key to what he had spent his whole existence keeping locked away. Whether Marika foresaw this outcome when she first bound Maliketh to herself as her shadow, or whether it emerged only through the accumulated consequences of choices neither of them could have anticipated in whole, the design itself carried, from its very beginning, the seed of this final and inescapable irony. What this final unbinding means for the lands between, and what it reveals about the whole meaning of Maliketh's long and sorrowful existence, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow, in the final part, we sit with the final plea, the words Maliketh offers in his last moments, and what they reveal about a devotion that outlasted every betrayal it was ever asked to endure. Sleep well. Tomorrow, in the final part, we sit with the final plea Maliketh offers in his last moments, and what it reveals about a devotion no betrayal could ever unmake in whole. We have followed Maliketh from the shadowbound to Marika's side, through the hunt that claimed Destined Death from a god-slaying queen, through the theft that broke his guardianship and the flesh he sealed around the power he had sworn to guard, through grief and exile and a hunger no gathering could ever satisfy, to the ancient shrine where his long vigilance meets, at last, its final test. Tonight, In this final part, we come to what remains when all of this ends. A handful of last words, offered to a queen who may never hear them, and what they reveal about a devotion no betrayal ever unmade in whole. Tonight we sit with the final plea Maliketh offers in his last moments, and what it reveals about a devotion no betrayal could ever unmake in whole. Tonight, in this final part, we sit with the final plea Maliketh offers in his last moments, and what it reveals about a devotion no betrayal could ever unmake in whole. Words for a queen who betrayed him. In his final moments, having given every fragment of deathroot he could gather in service of a hope that never reached its end, Maliketh's last words turn not to bitterness, but to a plea for Marika's forgiveness. Should the Tarnished have delivered every fragment of deathroot the lands between still held before facing Maliketh at Farum Azula? His final words as he falls carry a weight this whole story has been building toward from its very first telling. A plea, not a curse, offered to the very queen whose betrayal, hinted at since the earliest fragments of his story, had cost him everything he once held dear. "Forgive me, Marika," he asks in his last moments, before admitting what his whole long exile had already taught him, that the Golden Order cannot be restored. There is something worth sitting with in the shape of this final utterance. A being who had lost his nephew to the very power he failed to guard, who had watched the order he helped found collapse without any comfort offered him in return, who had spent ages in exile pursuing a hope that proved as hollow as the promise of restoration itself, chooses, in his final breath, apology over accusation. He asks forgiveness of the very figure whose betrayal this story marked from its opening words, a plea directed outward rather than inward, toward Marika's judgment rather than toward his own grief. This is not the response of a being consumed by resentment, however much resentment his long and sorrowful existence might reasonably have earned him. It is the response of a being whose devotion, forged across ages of service and tested by every loss his existence could offer, still reaches, in its final moment, toward the one relationship that first gave his whole existence its shape and its purpose. There is a particular weight in imagining the silence that must have followed these final words, a plea offered to a queen who, whatever her own fate by this point in the lands between's long history, was in no position to answer him. Maliketh's forgiveness is asked into an absence, offered to someone who cannot respond, cannot forgive him in turn, cannot even confirm that his words were heard at all. This makes the plea, in its own way, purer than any exchange that might have followed a reply, a devotion offered because it needed, in that final moment, to be spoken, rather than in any hope of reconciliation. Whether such words ever reached the one they were meant for, whether Marika's own scattered and fragmented existence by this point in the story could ever have registered a shadow's final plea, the lands between offers no answer. Perhaps this uncertainty is itself part of what makes the plea so affecting. Maliketh asks forgiveness not because he expects to receive it, but because asking is the last honest act available to a being who has given everything else already. There is something worth naming in the choice to speak these words aloud at all, rather than carrying them unvoiced into whatever ending awaited him. A being as disciplined and as reticent as Maliketh had shown himself to be across the whole of this story, a shadow who moved unseen and unquestioned through most of his long existence, chose, in his very last moment, to break that reticence entirely, to speak plainly what he had otherwise carried in silence for ages. This final act of speech stands apart from nearly everything else this story has followed him doing. a single moment of open vulnerability offered by a being who had spent his whole existence guarding against precisely that kind of exposure. Mars. What the play reveals. Maliketh's final words reveal a devotion that survived every betrayal this story has followed, a loyalty that outlasted grief, exile, and the collapse of everything it was originally given to serve. Consider what it means for a plea of this kind to emerge from a being who has, by any reasonable measure, earned the right to something closer to bitterness. Maliketh gave his independence to become Marika's shadow. He gave his body to become a vessel for Destined Death. He gave his nephew, in the end, to a power he failed to guard closely enough, and he gave the whole of his remaining existence to an exile spent chasing a hope that could never have succeeded. At every turn, the story hinted at a betrayal still waiting somewhere ahead of him. A queen would not honor what her shadow had sacrificed on her behalf. And still, facing his own death, his final thought turns toward asking her forgiveness rather than assigning her blame. This reveals a devotion built on something deeper than simple reciprocity, a loyalty that never demanded, as its price, an equal measure of care returned in kind. Where many bonds falter the moment one party gives more than the other repays, Maliketh's devotion to Marika persisted, through an imbalance most beings would have found impossible to sustain across even a fraction of the ages he endured it. Whatever kinship first bound half-sibling and shadow together, it proved sturdy enough to survive not merely disappointment, but genuine and repeated loss, without ever curdling into the resentment such loss might reasonably have produced in almost any other being. And there is a particular grace in the second half of his final words, the admission that the Golden Order cannot be restored. This is not denial, not a plea offered in ignorance of how thoroughly everything he served has already fallen. Maliketh dies with clear eyes, understanding precisely what has been lost and precisely how little hope remains of ever recovering it. His forgiveness is asked not because he believes restoration still waits somewhere ahead, but in spite of knowing, with total certainty, that it does not. There is a particular kind of courage in facing one's death with this clarity, refusing whatever comfort a false hope might have offered, even in these final moments. Many beings, confronting their own end, reach for whatever consolation remains within reach, however slight or however unearned. Maliketh reaches instead for the plainest possible truth, naming the Golden Order's ruin without softening or qualification, even as he asks forgiveness of the very figure whose choices had done so much to bring that ruin about. He does not soften his own account of what has been lost in order to make his final plea easier to offer. He offers the plea and the plain truth together, refusing to let one comfort obscure the other. A loyalty beyond reason. Maliketh's devotion to Marika defies any explanation built purely on reason or reciprocity, standing instead as a loyalty given because it was his nature to give it, regardless of what it cost him or what it earned him in return. There is a temptation, in trying to make sense of Maliketh's final plea, to search for some rational calculation behind it, some remaining hope or some strategic purpose his forgiveness might serve. The Lands Between offers no such comfortable explanation. Maliketh's loyalty to Marika was never built on calculation, never conditioned upon a fair exchange of sacrifice for reward. It was, from the very first binding that made him her shadow, a devotion given because giving it was, in some essential sense, who he was, a beast whose whole nature had been shaped around loyalty long before Marika ever claimed him, and who continued to express that loyalty even when every reasonable measure suggested he owed her nothing further. This kind of devotion sits uneasily beside the more transactional loyalties this whole story has otherwise followed. The alliances and bargains struck across the lands between in service of mutual benefit. Maliketh's loyalty to Marika was never transactional in this sense. It persisted past the point where any reasonable calculation would have counselled its abandonment, past the death of his nephew, past the collapse of the order he had bled for, past every disappointment his long existence accumulated. It survived because it was never contingent on being repaid in the first place, a loyalty given as freely and as wholly as the wild devotion the ancient shrines carved wolves once offered a young Empyrean, ages before any of this story's grief had yet been written. There is a way of understanding this devotion that sets it apart from mere stubbornness, or an inability to imagine any other path. A being capable of the discipline Maliketh demonstrated across every age of this story, the mastery of his own wild nature, the careful sealing of the black blade, the patient endurance of a hunger that never once let itself collapse into despair until every possibility had been exhausted, was never a being incapable of choosing differently. He could have turned against Marika. He could have joined whatever resistance rose against her remaining authority in the wake of the Golden Order's fall. That he chose loyalty instead, again and again, across every opportunity circumstance offered him to choose otherwise, marks his devotion as something deliberately sustained rather than merely inevitable, a choice renewed at every juncture rather than a rut he never found the will to leave. Whether this makes Maliketh's devotion admirable or merely tragic, the lands between leaves for each listener to decide. What is certain is that it represents something rare, in the truest sense, in a realm so often defined by ambition, betrayal, and the grasping pursuit of power, a loyalty that asked for nothing in return and received, in the end, almost nothing beyond the chance to give itself in whole, one final time, in a plea offered to a queen who may never hear it at all. Cha, what remains? So we come to the end, and to what Maliketh leaves behind. Not a throne, not a shard of the ring, but a devotion so complete it survived every loss this story has followed, offered to the last as freely as it was first given. This has been the story of Maliketh, the shadowbound beast who defeated a god-slain queen, who sealed the whole of Destined Death within his own flesh, who lost a nephew to the very power he had sworn to guard, who wandered the lands between in a beast clergyman's tattered robes, seeking a redemption that never came, and who returned, at the end of everything, to the ancient shrine where his story first began, to offer his final words not in anger, but in a plea for forgiveness. Unlike the demigods who warred across the shattered lands between for shards of a broken ring, Maliketh sought nothing for himself across the whole of his long existence. He asked no throne, claimed no domain, pursued no ambition beyond the single purpose given to him at the very beginning of his service. What he offered instead was total. His body, his independence, his nephew's memory, his whole existence folded into a devotion that outlasted every reason it might reasonably have ended. There is a final thought worth carrying away from the whole of this long story, one that reaches beyond Maliketh's own particular grief, towards something closer to universal truth. Devotion given without any expectation of return asks something of the one who gives it that few beings, mortal or otherwise, ever managed to sustain across a lifetime, let alone across the ages Maliketh endured. That he sustained it to the very last, offering forgiveness rather than accusation, even as he understood, with total clarity, that everything he had served was already lost, marks his story as one of the quietest and most enduring tragedies the lands between has ever produced. A devotion that asked for nothing and, in its own strange way, needed nothing in return to remain complete. The golden order he helped found lies broken now, as broken as the blade he once carried at his side before sealing it within his own flesh. The queen he served will never answer the plea his final words offered her. And still, somewhere in the quiet ruin of Crumbling Farum Azula, the ancient shrine remains, its carved walls still kneeling in prayer beneath a primordial ring, a monument to a devotion that asked for nothing and gave, in the end, everything it had, told slowly, for the quiet between waking and whatever waits in the dark. Good night, my friend.